Don't eat that cake. The frightened voice of a 2-year-old little girl echoed across the glittering ballroom, just as the most feared Mafia boss in New York lifted the silver knife to cut the evening's grand cake. For a heartbeat, the music stopped. Conversations died. Hundreds of powerful guests turned toward the tiny child standing beside her horrified mother. Most people smiled, assuming it was nothing more than childish innocence. Only one man didn't. Alexander Kane lowered the knife and looked directly into the little girl's eyes. Less than 5 minutes later, the celebration that had begun with laughter became the scene of an attempted massacre, and the smallest person inside Kane Manor will become the only witness who could expose the greatest betrayal the Kane Empire had ever faced. Stay with me until the very end, because what begins with one innocent warning will uncover a conspiracy capable of destroying an empire and forever changing the lives of everyone inside it. For one long moment, nobody moved. The little girl's warning lingered in the magnificent ballroom like a note that refused to fade. Don't eat that cake. For simple words, spoken by a child barely old enough to tie her own shoes. Yet somehow, those words carried enough weight to silence a room filled with governors, judges, billionaires, celebrities, foreign dignitaries, and some of the most dangerous men in America. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of perfectly dressed guests. The orchestra stopped halfway through a melody. Champagne glasses remained suspended halfway to smiling lips. Even the photographers lowered their cameras without realizing they had done so. Every eye slowly turned toward the tiny girl, standing near the enormous 5-tiered white cake. Grace Whitfield felt every heartbeat pounding inside her chest. Her face drained of color. She hurried across the polished marble floor, dropped to one knee beside her daughter, and gently wrapped trembling hands around Ella's shoulders. "Oh, sweetheart." Her voice barely came out. "Ella, you can't interrupt." Then Grace looked up. Standing only a few feet away was Alexander Kane. For years, she had worked quietly inside Kane Manor. She knew the stories whispered among the staff. Some called him ruthless. Others called him merciless. Enemies simply called him the last man they ever crossed. Grace had always kept her head down, spoken only when necessary, and prayed she would never become the center of his attention. Now her little daughter had interrupted the most important moment of the evening. I'm so sorry, Mr. Kane." The apology tumbled out almost faster than she could breathe. "Please forgive her. She doesn't understand. She's only 2. I'll take her outside immediately." She reached to lift Ella into her arms. Before she could, Alexander quietly raised one hand, not as a threat, simply asking her to wait. The entire ballroom watched. No one had expected anger, but no one expected this either. Alexander slowly placed the ceremonial cake knife onto the white linen tablecloth. The soft metallic sound seemed unusually loud inside the silent hall. He looked neither at the guests nor at his security team. His attention never left the little girl. Beside him stood young Noah, dressed in a navy blue suit that matched Alexander's. The boy looked from the untouched cake to Ella with wide, confused eyes. He didn't understand why everyone had suddenly stopped smiling. Alexander took one slow step forward, then another, until he stood directly in front of Ella. To the astonishment of everyone watching, the man whose name inspired fear across an entire criminal empire bent down onto one knee, his expensive suit pressed lightly against the polished marble floor. The movement sent a quiet murmur through the crowd. Many of the guests had negotiated business deals with Alexander. Others had watched him settle disputes between rival organizations. None of them had ever seen him lower himself for anyone, least of all a servant's child. His expression softened. The hard edges disappeared from his face. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the authority that usually filled boardrooms and backroom meetings. Instead, it carried the calm patience of someone speaking to a frightened child. "Can you tell me why I shouldn't eat the cake?" Ella looked first at her mother. Grace offered a nervous smile, though fear still clouded her eyes. Then Ella turned back toward Alexander. Her tiny fingers tightened around the fabric of her mother's apron. For a few seconds, she simply stared at him. Alexander didn't interrupt. Years of surviving betrayals had taught him that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. Finally, Ella lifted one small finger. She pointed toward the towering cake. The man... Her tiny voice almost disappeared beneath the silence. The man with the black gloves. Alexander's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. What man? Ella frowned, trying to remember. The man by the kitchen. She looked toward the hallway behind the banquet room. He thought nobody was there. Grace blinked. Kitchen hallway? Ella had wandered away only a few minutes earlier, while Grace was helping prepare the dessert tables. At the time, Grace assumed her daughter had simply been exploring the mansion. Alexander remained perfectly still. What did you see? Ella looked down for a second before answering. He opened the cake. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. Alexander's head of security subtly touched the earpiece hidden beneath his collar. No words were spoken. The guards were already becoming alert. Ella continued. He put little shiny things inside. She stretched both hands apart, tried to explain. Then he covered them up again. A ripple of unease spread across the room. Grace stared at her daughter in confusion. What shiny things, sweetheart? Ella shrugged. I don't know. Then she added the sentence that instantly transformed uncertainty into genuine fear. He said they were medicine. Alexander's expression didn't change. Inside, every instinct he had developed over 2 decades of surviving assassination attempts awakened at once. Children often misunderstood what they saw, but they rarely invented details with such effortless sincerity, especially details that made no sense to them. He asked one final question. Did the man say anything else? Ella nodded immediately. He was talking on the phone. The ballroom grew even quieter. He said... She paused, trying to remember every word. Everything is ready. Another pause. Nobody will leave alive. Several guests gasped. One elderly woman instinctively stepped backward. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered across the marble floor. Alexander finally stood. The kindness that had softened his face only moments earlier vanished. The calm father disappeared. In his place stood the man who ruled the Kane Empire. His voice became cold, precise, controlled. No one touches the cake. He looked toward a security chief. Seal every entrance. Another order followed immediately. Nobody leaves this estate. Within seconds, heavily armed guards moved into position around the ballroom. Guests looked at one another in stunned disbelief. Some believed the warning. Others thought Alexander was simply being cautious. No one argued. Alexander walked toward the towering white cake. Every step echoed across the silent hall. He stopped only inches away from it. The candles continued burning peacefully, as though nothing in the world had changed. The frosting looked flawless. The decorations remained perfect. Yet Alexander no longer saw dessert. He saw a possible execution, waiting beneath layers of sugar and cream. Without taking his eyes off the cake, he spoke one final command. Bring the bomb disposal unit. The room froze again, because in that single sentence, everyone realized Alexander Kane believed the little girl. Alexander remained kneeling in front of Ella, his steady gaze fixed on the little girl's face. Around them, nearly 300 guests stood in complete silence, waiting for the child to speak again. No one dared whisper. Even the musicians remained frozen, their instruments hanging motionless in their hands. Ella's tiny fingers tightened around the edge of her mother's apron. Grace could feel her daughter's hands trembling. It's okay, Alexander said gently, his voice carrying none of the authority that had built one of the most feared criminal empires in the country. You're not in trouble. I just need you to tell me everything you remember. Ella nodded slowly. The man was by the kitchen, she whispered. Alexander waited. He had black gloves. What else? He looked around first. She pointed toward the hallway leading to the service corridor. He thought nobody was watching. Grace frowned in confusion. Sweetheart, when did you see him? When I was looking for you. Grace's heart sank. Earlier, while helping the catering staff prepare the desserts, she had lost sight of Ella for less than 2 minutes. At the time, she assumed the little girl had wandered into one of the nearby sitting rooms. Alexander's instincts sharpened. What did the man do? Ella looked toward the towering white cake. He opened it. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. Alexander didn't react outwardly. He opened the cake he repeated. Ella nodded. He lifted it. She raised both little hands, demonstrating how the stranger had carefully removed one of the cake's upper layers. He put little shiny things inside. What kind of shiny things? The little girl shrugged. They looked like tiny candies. Grace shook her head. I don't understand. Ella continued innocently, but he said they weren't candy. Alexander leaned forward slightly. What did he call them? The little girl frowned as she searched for the exact word. Medicine. The word landed heavily across the ballroom. Alexander's expression remained unreadable, but inside, every warning instinct he possessed was screaming. Children often misunderstood what they saw. They confused objects. They forgot details. But they almost never invented conversations with such simple consistency. What happened after that? He asked quietly. Ella looked toward the service hallway again. He talked on his phone. What did he say? She closed her eyes for a second, trying to remember. He said, her small forehead wrinkled with concentration. Everything is inside now. Another pause. Then he said, she looked directly into Alexander's eyes. After they eat, nobody will know what happened. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Someone dropped a champagne flute. The crystal shattered against a marble floor, the sound startling everyone back into motion. Alexander slowly rose to his feet. The warmth that had softened his features disappeared instantly. His face became cold, focused, decisive. He turned toward the head of a security detail. Nobody touches that cake. The guard nodded immediately. Alexander continued issuing orders with calm precision. Seal every entrance. Lock every gate. No guest leaves the estate. Within seconds, armed security personnel spread to the ballroom, positioning themselves at every exit. Several guests protested at once. This is absurd. There must be some mistake. We're being detained? Alexander silenced them with a single glance. If there is no threat, he said evenly, you'll all be home shortly. Then he looked back at the cake. If there is... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Two security officers approached the towering 5-tier cake with extraordinary caution. One carried a portable inspection kit, while another carefully examined the base without making contact. The room watched in breathless silence. Minutes stretched endlessly. The lead technician slowly circled the table. He frowned. There are signs of recent tampering. Alexander stepped closer. What did you find? The frosting around the second tier has been resealed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The technician carefully inserted a thin inspection tool beneath the decorative icing. With painstaking care, he lifted part of the outer layer. Everyone leaned forward. Hidden beneath the flawless white frosting sat dozens of tiny transparent capsules arranged in neat rows. The ballroom fell into stunned silence. Inside each capsule rested a pale liquid that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers. No one spoke. The technician's face lost all color. Oh my God! He carefully removed one capsule, using protective tweezers. Another followed. Then another. There are dozens of them. Alexander stared without blinking. What are they? The technician swallowed hard. I can't identify the substance here. He looked toward the medical team that had been stationed at the event. But whatever this is... He held one capsule toward the light. It was designed to dissolve after the cake was sliced. The chief physician stepped forward, examining the capsule without touching it. If these had broken inside the cake... He looked around at the hundreds of guests filling the ballroom. Everyone who ate even a small piece could have been exposed. The word spread through the mansion like wildfire. Guests stumbled backward from the dessert table. Some parents grabbed their children and held them tightly. Others covered their mouths in horror. A woman fainted near the front of the ballroom, collapsing into her husband's arms. Medical personnel rushed toward her, while additional doctors began checking guests who feared they might have been exposed somehow. People started crying. Others shouted questions that no one could answer. The once elegant celebration dissolved into confusion and fear. Alexander never took his eyes off the poison cake. It had been placed at the very center of the room. Perfect, beautiful, deadly. He slowly turned toward a security chief. This wasn't an attack meant only for me. The guard nodded grimly. No, sir. Alexander's jaw tightened. Someone intended to murder every person in this mansion. His gaze drifted toward Grace and little Ella, who stood together surrounded by frightened guests. The tiny girl had unknowingly prevented one of the deadliest massacres in the city's history. And if the people responsible realized she had exposed their plan, Alexander knew exactly who their next target would be. The grand ballroom had become a command center. Crystal chandeliers still glowed above polished marble floors, but the celebration had vanished. Half-finished champagne glasses sat abandoned on tables. The orchestra packed away their instruments in silence, while frightened guests remained gathered under the watchful eyes of armed guards. No one was allowed to leave. Alexander Kane stood at the center of the room, watching his men secure every entrance to the estate. "The gates?" he asked. "Locked, sir." "The perimeter?" "Completely sealed." "The docks?" "Closed." "The helipad?" "Disabled until further notice." Alexander gave a single nod. No one enters. No one leaves. The order spread across Kane Manor within minutes. Steel security shutters descended over lesser-used exits. Vehicles approaching the estate were turned away before reaching the front gates. Every phone call leaving the property was monitored. Whoever had orchestrated the poisoning was still somewhere inside Alexander's circle. He intended to make sure they stayed there. The ballroom slowly emptied as guests were escorted into separate reception rooms where doctors continued routine examinations. Every person who had attended the gala would remain inside the mansion until Alexander was satisfied they had been questioned. Meanwhile, Grace and Ella were escorted upstairs by their newly assigned security team. Grace glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Will this take long?" One of the guards answered politely. "As long as Mr. Kane believes you're safe, ma'am." She looked down at Ella, who was already beginning to grow sleepy after the terrifying evening. Grace kissed the little girl's forehead. She had no idea that downstairs, an empire had begun hunting because of her daughter's courage. Alexander walked into the mansion's private conference room. Within minutes, dozens of staff members lined up outside. Servants, gardeners, drivers, chefs, housekeepers, waiters, electricians, security guards. Nobody was exempt. The questioning began immediately. Alexander sat silently at the head of the long mahogany table, while his chief investigators worked through the staff one by one. "Name: Daniel Brooks. Position: assistant pastry chef. What were your duties today?" "I prepared decorations for the dessert tables." "Who handled the main cake?" "Chef Lorenzo." "Who touched it after arrived?" I don't know." Every answer was carefully documented. Every timeline compared. Every contradiction highlighted. Hours passed. One employee after another entered. One employee after another left. Some cried from fear. Others became defensive. Most were simply confused. Alexander listened without interrupting. He noticed tiny details most people ignored. A hesitation before answering. Eyes drifting toward the floor. Hands shaking too much. Sweat forming despite the cool air. Years of leading a criminal empire had made deception almost impossible to hide from him. Yet something felt wrong. Everyone appeared frightened. No one appeared guilty. By midnight, the investigation shifted toward the mansion's kitchens. The executive chef stood beside stainless steel preparation tables as investigators carefully reconstructed the day's events. "When did the cake arrive?" Alexander asked. 11:30 this morning." "Who accepted delivery?" "I did." "Was the box sealed?" "Yes." "Were there any delays?" The chef thought for a moment. "The floors arrived at nearly the same time." And the loading entrance became crowded. Alexander's eyes narrowed. For how long? Maybe 7 or 8 minutes. One investigator immediately made a note. 7 minutes. Long enough for someone familiar with the property to disappear into the kitchen unnoticed. The delivery logs were spread across the preparation counter. Every shipment was checked. Flowers, wine, fresh seafood, imported fruit, decorations. Nothing appeared unusual, until one investigator frowned. "Sir," Alexander looked up. "One signature is missing." The room became silent. A receipt for specialty baking supplies contained no receiving signature, only a blank line where the employee's name should have been. Who unloaded this truck? Alexander asked. Nobody answered. The chef looked from one kitchen worker to another. I don't remember. Alexander didn't like that answer. He turned toward a security chief. I want every delivery driver located. Tonight. Yes, sir. As investigators continued examining invoices, another team entered the mansion surveillance control room. Rows of monitors covered one wall. Normally, they displayed every hallway, entrance, staircase, and service corridor inside Kane Manor. Tonight, several screens remained black. The technician frowned. That's strange. He tapped the keyboard. Nothing changed. He checked another monitor. Still nothing. Alexander arrived moments later. What happened? The technician looked unsettled. I'm trying to recover today's recordings. Can you? His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. Then he stopped. His face turned pale. They're gone. Alexander's voice became dangerously quiet. Gone. Someone erased them. Every recording from the previous 6 hours had disappeared. Not corrupted. Not damaged. Deliberately deleted. The technician swallowed hard. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't erase everything. They only removed footage covering the kitchen corridors, the loading dock, and the ballroom. Alexander stared at the blank screens. The attack hadn't been improvised. It had been meticulously planned. Someone had poisoned the cake. Someone had erased the evidence. Someone inside Kane Manor understood the entire security system. Only a handful of people possessed that level of access. Alexander slowly turned toward a security chief. Who can delete surveillance recordings? The answer came almost immediately. You, my deputy, the head technician, and Dominic Russo. The room fell silent. Dominic Russo, Alexander's longtime chief of security, the man who had protected the Kane family for more than 20 years, the man who personally designed the surveillance network protecting the estate. Alexander said nothing. He remembered Dominic teaching young recruits how to identify threats before they appeared. He remembered Dominic standing beside him during countless negotiations. He remembered trusting him with Noah's safety without hesitation. His investigators exchanged uneasy glances. One finally spoke. Sir, Alexander didn't take his eyes off the dark monitors. What? The surveillance deletions required Dominic's master authorization. The words hung heavily in the room. No one wanted to say what everyone was beginning to think. Alexander finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. Bring Dominic Russo to me. The investigator hesitated. Do you want him arrested? Alexander looked at the empty surveillance screens one last time. Then he answered, No. A long silence followed. Not until I hear his explanation. But as he left the surveillance room, a thought he had spent years refusing to entertain crept into his mind. If Dominic Russo had betrayed him, then the enemy hadn't broken into Kane Manor. The enemy had been living inside it all along. By 2 o'clock in the morning, Kane Manor had transformed into a fortress. Floodlights illuminated every corner of the sprawling estate. Armed guards patrolled the grounds in pairs, while black SUVs blocked every entrance leading to the mansion. Inside, investigators worked without pause, piecing together timelines, interviewing witnesses, and searching for anything the attackers might have overlooked. Alexander Kane stood alone in the surveillance room, staring at the dark monitors that should have contained the answers he desperately needed. Instead, they reflected only his own grim expression. A knock sounded at the door. His security chief entered. We found Dominic. Alexander didn't turn. Where? South Security Office. He was coordinating perimeter patrols. Alexander finally faced him. Did he try to leave? No, sir. Did he resist? No. That answer lingered in Alexander's mind. If Dominic had orchestrated the attack, fleeing would have been the obvious choice. Instead, he had remained at his post as though nothing had happened. Bring him here. 10 minutes later, Dominic Russo walked into the conference room. At 60 years old, his broad shoulders still carried the posture of a soldier. Silver streaked his dark hair, and years of protecting the Kane family had left deep lines around his steady eyes. He looked tired but composed. He glanced around the room before meeting Alexander's gaze. "You wanted to see me." Alexander studied him for several silent moments. For more than 20 years, Dominic had stood beside him. He had protected Alexander's father. He had carried a wounded Alexander out of a warehouse after an assassination attempt 15 years earlier. He had taught Noah how to recognize danger without frightening him. Remembering those moments made what came next even harder. Alexander slid a folder across the table. Someone erased 6 hours of surveillance footage. Dominic frowned. "I heard. The deletions required master authorization. I know. There are only 4 people who possess that clearance." Dominic nodded slowly. "I know that too." Alexander leaned forward. "One of those names is yours." For the first time that evening, something flickered across Dominic's face. Not guilt, surprise. "You're accusing me?" "I'm asking for an explanation." Dominic shook his head immediately. "I didn't erase anything." Alexander watched him carefully. "Can anyone else use your credentials?" "No." "Has anyone had access to your office?" "I lock it every night." "Your passwords?" "They exist only here." Dominic tapped his temple. Silence settled over the room. Alexander wanted to believe him. Every instinct born from years of friendship urged him to dismiss the evidence. But the evidence refused to disappear. Finally, Alexander stood. "I'm sorry." Dominic looked up. "For what?" "I have to treat you like every other suspect." The words landed harder than any accusation. 2 guards stepped forward. One removed Dominic's sidearm. The other collected his phone. Neither man enjoyed the task. Dominic had trained most of the guard himself. One of them couldn't even meet his eyes. Dominic slowly extended his hands. "You don't need the cuffs." Alexander hesitated, then nodded. "No handcuffs." The guards escorted Dominic toward the waiting vehicles outside. As the heavy doors closed behind them, Alexander remained standing in the conference room. Something still felt wrong. Dominic hadn't argued. He hadn't demanded a lawyer. He hadn't shouted. He had simply accepted the arrest with quiet dignity. That wasn't the reaction of a desperate traitor. It was a reaction of a man carrying an unbearable burden. Outside, rain had begun falling over Kane Manor. 3 black SUVs rolled through the front gates. Dominic sat inside the middle vehicle between 2 security officers. The convoy headed toward one of Alexander's secure holding facilities across the city. Inside the lead vehicle, the driver spoke into his radio. "Convoy moving." The response crackled through the speaker. "Route confirmed." None of them noticed a pair of dark vans parked beneath an abandoned overpass several blocks ahead. Inside the vans, masked gunmen watched the approaching headlights. One man lowered a pair of binoculars. Middle vehicle. Another chambered a round into his rifle. "Don't miss." Seconds later, the first explosion shattered the quiet night. The lead SUV erupted in sparks as a tire burst violently, sending the vehicle swerving across the rain-soaked road. Before the guards could react, automatic gunfire exploded from both sides of the street. Bullets slammed into armored doors and shattered windshields. The convoy became a storm of flying glass and screaming metal. "Ambush!" someone shouted over the radio. The middle SUV lurched sideways as its driver fought to avoid a second explosion. Dominic instinctively shoved the guard beside him to the floor just as bullets tore through the side windows. Glass rained across the seats. The driver lost control. The SUV spun twice before crashing sideways into a concrete barrier. Airbags exploded. Smoke filled the cabin. Outside, gunfire continued relentlessly. The rear security team returned fire, forcing several attackers behind parked vehicles. Dominic shook away the dizziness, clouding his vision. Blood trickled from a cut above his eyebrow. One of the guards beside him wasn't moving. Another struggled to breathe, clutching his shoulder. The rear door refused to open. The collision had crushed the frame. Without thinking, Dominic kicked the damaged door with everything he had. Once, twice. On the third strike, the twisted metal gave way. "Move!" he shouted, pulling the wounded guard after him. Bullets struck the pavement inches from their feet. Dominic dragged the injured man behind the overturned SUV just as another burst of gunfire ripped through the vehicle's interior. The attackers weren't trying to stop the convoy. They weren't trying to rescue anyone. They were trying to kill one man. Police sirens echoed faintly in the distance. The gunmen exchanged quick signals. Within seconds, they retreated into the darkness, disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. Rain continued falling over the shattered roadway. Emergency lights painted the wet pavement in flashing red and blue. Nearly 40 minutes later, Alexander arrived at the scene. His expensive shoes splashed through pools of rainwater as he surveyed the destruction. 3 vehicles were riddled with bullet holes. Several of his men were being loaded into ambulances. The smell of burned rubber and gunpowder still hung in the air. His security chief approached, his suit stained with blood. "Dominic?" He survived. Alexander exhaled quietly. "Barely." The chief lowered his voice. "Sir, whoever planned this wasn't trying to free him." Alexander looked toward the wrecked convoy. He already knew the answer. They wanted him dead. His eyes hardened, because a dead suspect couldn't reveal names. A dead suspect couldn't expose conspirators. A dead suspect took every secret to the grave. For the first time since the poison cake had been discovered, Alexander realized something far more dangerous than betrayal. Dominic Russo might not be the mastermind. He might be the next victim. And somewhere in the shadows, the real architect of the massacre had just failed to silence the only man who could expose the truth. The intensive care floor of St. Gabriel's Medical Center had never seen security like this before. Every entrance was guarded by heavily armed members of the Kane organization. Police officers, unaware of Dominic Russo's true identity, believed they were protecting an important witness in an organized crime investigation. They had no idea that inside room 814 lay the man who might hold the fate of one of the nation's most powerful criminal empires. Alexander Kane stood outside the room before dawn, staring through the narrow glass window. Dominic lay motionless beneath crisp white sheets. His forehead was bandaged. Bruises darkened one side of his face. Machines measured every heartbeat, every breath, every sign that he was still alive. The doctors had removed 2 bullets from his shoulder and another from his side. They called his survival miraculous. Alexander called it inconvenient. For someone, whoever had ambushed the convoy had fired hundreds of rounds. Not to intimidate, not to delay, to kill. That meant Dominic knew something worth dying to protect. A doctor quietly approached. "Mr. Kane." Alexander turned. "We recovered security footage from Victor's office garage." The recording appeared on the largest monitor. Timestamp, 3 hours earlier. Victor walked calmly toward a waiting black sedan. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't frightened. He carried only a single leather briefcase. Before entering the car, he stopped. Slowly, he turned toward one of the garage cameras. Then he smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not the smile of a man escaping. The smile of someone who had planned every step. Victor looked directly into the camera lens. Then he raised 2 fingers to his temple in a casual salute. The sedan drove away. The screen went black. No one spoke. Alexander replayed the footage twice. Then a third time. Victor hadn't fled because he was lucky. He had fled because someone had warned him. Someone inside Alexander's organization was still feeding him information. Marcus broke the silence. "What now?" Alexander's eyes never left the frozen image of Victor's smile. "Now." His voice was colder than anyone in the room had ever heard. "We stop hunting one traitor." He slowly turned toward the officers surrounding the operations table. "We hunt 2. The room fell silent, because Victor had escaped before every raid. Then the betrayal inside the Kane Empire wasn't over. It had only just begun. The image of Victor DeLuca's confident smile still glowed on the command center's largest monitor when Alexander's phone vibrated. Only 3 people possessed that private number. He answered immediately. "Yes." The voice on the other end shook with panic. "Mr. Kane?" It was one of the guards assigned to Grace and Ella. Alexander's stomach tightened. "What happened?" A brief silence. Then words that made the room seem to shrink around him. "They're gone." Alexander froze. "What did you say?" "Grace and Ella are missing." The command center fell silent as every officer watched Alexander's expression change. His voice became dangerously calm. Start from the beginning. The guard swallowed hard. About 20 minutes ago, Grace asked if she could take Ella upstairs for a nap. We escorted them to the East guest suite, and a nurse arrived. Alexander frowned. A nurse? She said the hospital had sent someone to examine Ella because of possible poison exposure. Marcus looked sharply toward Alexander. No hospital sent anyone, he whispered. Alexander already knew. His grip tightened around the phone. Continue. She showed hospital identification. Who verified it? We called the number printed on the badge. Alexander closed his eyes. The number belonged to them. Yes, sir. The guard's voice cracked with guilt. We didn't know. What happened next? The nurse entered the room. 5 minutes later, another guard went to check on them. His breathing became uneven. The room was empty. Alexander was already walking toward the door. Seal the estate. It already is. Then nobody leaves until I know exactly how 2 people disappeared from the safest mansion in New York. He ended the call. No one spoke. Marcus finally broke the silence. Victor. Alexander nodded once. He moved faster than we expected. Minutes later, Alexander stormed into the East guest wing. The hallway buzzed with investigators. Forensic photographers documented every inch of the suite, while fingerprint specialists dusted furniture and door handles. Grace's room looked almost untouched. Ella's favorite stuffed rabbit lay on the bed. A coloring book remained open on the floor beside a handful of crayons. One tiny pink shoe rested beneath a chair. Grace would never have left without it. Alexander slowly walked through the room. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing suggested violence. That disturbed him more than if the room had been destroyed. Report. A forensic investigator stepped forward. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. No blood. What about fingerprints? Dozens. He held up a sealed evidence bag. But one set belongs to someone wearing medical gloves. Alexander looked toward the half-finished cup of tea sitting on the bedside table. Was that tested? Yes. The investigator nodded. Powerful sedative. Marcus cursed quietly. They drugged Grace. Alexander's eyes drifted toward Ella's stuffed rabbit. Children rarely left beloved toys behind willingly, especially not Ella. A second investigator hurried into the room, carrying security photographs. We found something. He spread several printed images across the table. Camera 1, an unfamiliar woman wearing a nurse's uniform entering the guest wing. Camera 2, the same woman pushing an empty medical wheelchair. Camera 3, nothing. The hallway recording simply ended. Alexander looked up. What happened? The feed cuts out for exactly 43 seconds. Marcus sighed heavily. Another blind spot. No. The technician shook his head. The footage wasn't erased. It was interrupted. Remotely. Alexander's jaw tightened. Someone inside his own security network had helped again. A radio crackled. We found a vehicle. Everyone turned. Half a mile from the estate. Alexander immediately headed outside. The abandoned ambulance sat beside a deserted warehouse district. Its emergency lights had been removed. The hospital logos were fake. Inside, investigators discovered discarded uniforms, disposable gloves, and empty syringes. Nothing else. No fingerprints. No DNA. Professional. Very professional. Alexander walked slowly around the vehicle. Rain had begun falling again, washing away tire tracks before investigators could preserve them. He stared at the open rear doors. They planned this before the poisoning. Marcus looked at him. What do you mean? Alexander spoke quietly. They didn't improvise. They brought hospital uniforms. A fake ambulance. Forged identification. They expected to need an extraction. Marcus considered the thought. But why take Grace? Alexander turned toward him. They didn't. Marcus frowned. They came for Ella. Silence followed. Alexander continued. Grace was simply in the way. He looked toward the empty ambulance. Ella is the only person who saw the man with the black gloves. The only eyewitness. If Victor still doesn't know exactly how much she remembers, he paused. He can't risk leaving her behind. Marcus slowly nodded. They need her alive. Alexander's expression darkened. For now, those two words chilled everyone standing nearby. Back at Kane Manor, the command center exploded into activity. Large city maps covered every wall. Neighborhoods were divided into search sectors. Phones rang continuously. Helicopters prepared for takeoff. Safe houses, abandoned factories, shipping yards, train stations, and private airports were added to growing search lists. Alexander stood before the map. His voice carried across the room with unmistakable authority. Every warehouse Victor ever owned. Search them. Every abandoned property connected to his companies. Search them. I want every harbor watched. Every private runway monitored. No vehicle crosses a bridge without being checked. The order spread to the Kane Empire within minutes. Hundreds of loyal men abandoned sleep to join the search. Convoys rolled into the streets. Boats began patrolling the waterfront. Helicopters swept over industrial districts. Informants received photographs of Grace and little Ella. Every ally Alexander had ever trusted received one simple instruction: find them. Hours passed. The city awakened to another ordinary morning. Commuters filled sidewalks. Coffee shops opened. Children walked to school. Most people had no idea that beneath the surface of their city, one of the largest manhunts in recent memory had already begun. Alexander remained in the command center, refusing food, refusing rest. His eyes never left the city map. Then a technician suddenly looked up from his computer. "Sir." Alexander turned immediately. "We've received something." "What?" The technician swallowed. It came from Victor. An encrypted video file slowly loaded onto the main screen. Alexander stepped closer. The room fell completely silent, because everyone knew one thing. If Victor was contacting them, it meant Grace and Ella were still alive, and whatever came next would determine whether Alexander found them before time ran out.